Room 303. There was something strange about that motel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't old or run down, but there was an eerie feeling in the air as if something wasn't right. Marcos noticed it as soon as he walked through the reception door. "Just for one night," he said, taking out his wallet. The receptionist, a thin man with a tired look, was slow to respond. "Of course, sir. We have several rooms available." He paused awkwardly. "Except 303. That one's closed." Marcos going up without giving it any importance. They gave him room 305 on the second floor, right next to the forbidden room. He went up the stairs, walked down the dimly lit hallway and locked himself in his room. Everything was silent. A couple of hours passed. Marcos was about to fall asleep when he heard something. A muffled noise. Knocking. They were coming from room 303. He sat up in bed trying to hear better. Knocks, followed by a quieter sound like someone shuffling. He moved closer to the wall and put his ear to it. Nothing. But when he moved away, the noise came back. Knocks. Footsteps. And a whisper. "Help." Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up and walked out into the hallway. Everything was dark, only lit by a flickering light on the ceiling. The door to room 303 was closed, but something didn't fit. The "Do Not Disturb" sign hung crooked as if someone had grabbed it too tightly. "Hello?" he whispered, not knowing why. Silence. He moved a little closer. Then the door handle moved. A sharp knock echoed behind the wood. Marcos stepped back, feeling his heart racing. He didn't want to be there. He went back to his room, closed the door and locked it. He lay down on the bed, trying to convince himself it had been his imagination. But the phone rang. He jumped up in fright and looked at the nightstand. It couldn't be. The phone had no line. Still, the phone vibrated insistently. He hesitated for a moment but answered. "Hello?" On the other end, only heavy breathing could be heard. "Don't open the door," a voice whispered. The phone went silent. Marcos felt his stomach tighten. And then there was a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. His first instinct was to ignore it. But the knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. He approached slowly, feeling like each step weighed tons. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice breaking. No one answered. Just a whisper behind the wood. "Open up." Marcos froze. The knob began to turn, to shake as if someone was forcing it from the other side. He stepped back, his heart racing. And then the knock stopped. A dense silence invaded the room. Marcos waited. A few minutes passed. Maybe she had left. He took a deep breath and approached again. He glued his eye to the gaze. Nothing. Just the empty hallway. But when he looked down, two bare feet, pale and stained with dirt, waited right in front of the door. Marcos felt a lump in his throat. The doorknob began to move again, harder. He couldn't stay there. He walked away, looked for his phone to call the front desk, but he had no signal. And then the door opened by itself. Slowly. The darkness of the hallway seeped into the room. There was no one there. But the air turned cold. A murmur filled the room. "I found myself." A cold breath brushed his ear. And then the light went out. The last thing he heard was a whisper. And then nothing. When the receptionist came up the next day, he found the room empty. The bed untouched. The phone hanging. And the door to 303 ajar, as if someone had come out of there. But Marcos never showed up. The house that breathes. The first night Carlos spent in his deceased uncle's old house, he noticed something strange. A rhythmic, almost imperceptible sound, like a bellows slowly expanding and contracting. At first he attributed it to the old pipes or the wind seeping through the cracks in the centuries-old walls. "It's just an old house," he said to himself as he unpacked the few belongings he had brought with him. The inheritance had been unexpected. Carlos barely knew his uncle Ernesto, an eccentric and solitary man who had spent decades isolated on that property on the outskirts of the town of Santa Eulalia. The locals rarely spoke of him, and when they did, their voices dropped to whispers. "You made a good deal," the notary had told him with a forced smile as he handed him the keys. "But be careful with the basement stairs. They are unstable." The house was a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, high ceilings, and narrow passageways. Furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts frozen in time. Old paintings decorated the walls, all with the same motif. The house portrayed from different angles and at different times. Carlos settled into the master bedroom, the only space that seemed remotely habitable. While cleaning out decades of dust, he discovered a journal hidden in a secret compartment in the desk. The first few pages contained mundane observations about the weather and the upkeep of the property, written in his uncle's neat handwriting. But as the dates progressed, the entries became more disturbing. March 14, 1982, the house has expanded 3 centimeters since yesterday. I have measured it meticulously. No one believes me. April 27, 1982, the walls breathe when no one is looking. I have installed mirrors at strategic points so she can observe without her noticing. May 16, 1982, I found a new door today. It wasn't there yesterday. It leads to a hallway that shouldn't have existed according to the original plans. Carlos closed the journal with a mixture of uneasiness and skepticism. The ramblings of a senile old man, surely. Still, he had trouble falling asleep that night. The rhythmic sound persisted, as if something immense were breathing inside the walls. The next morning, Carlos decided to explore the basement, deliberately ignoring the notary's warning. The wooden staircase creaked under his weight as he descended with a flashlight. The atmosphere was stifling, the air thick and heavy with moisture. The basement turned out to be much more extensive than he had imagined. Brick tunnels stretched out in all directions, forming an impossible lattice that could not fit under the foundations of the house he knew. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered as he made his way down a particularly narrow hallway. His flashlight illuminated something in the wall, a small hole the size of a coin. As he approached, he felt a stream of warm air coming out of it like someone's breath. Instinctively, Carlos placed his eye on the hole. What he saw on the other side paralyzed him. A room identical to the bedroom where he had spent the night, with a figure sitting on the bed with its back to him. The figure moved slightly, breathing in rhythm with the sound that permeated the entire house. Slowly, as if responding to his gaze, the figure began to turn. Carlos jerked back, hitting his head on the low ceiling. When he regained his balance, the hole had disappeared. Only solid wall remained beneath his shaking fingers. Over the next few days, Carlos noticed subtle changes in the architecture of the house. Hallways that seemed longer, rooms that had changed size slightly, windows that looked out onto landscapes that did not correspond to the property's actual location. He also found more of his uncle's journals, hidden in various hiding places. The entries became increasingly frantic and confusing. July 23, 1982, I have measured the outside perimeter. It is 40 feet larger than yesterday. The house is growing but only on the inside. From the outside it maintains the same dimensions. August 4, 1982, I have tried marking the walls to draw a map. The marks disappear when I am not looking. She knows I am studying her. September 15, 1982, last night I found a room with all my belongings arranged exactly as I had them in my bedroom. But I never moved them there. It was as if the house had created a copy. October 30, 1982, I no longer try to leave. It won't let me. I have accepted my place here. The house and I are one now. The last entry, dated just a week before her uncle's official death, contained only one sentence written in almost unrecognizable handwriting. The house is not devouring me. It is making me part of its walls. One night, as he slept restlessly, Carlos was awakened by a different sound. It wasn't the usual breathing of the house, but something more urgent, like a racing heartbeat. The walls vibrated visibly. He followed the sound to a room he swore he'd never seen before. In the center was a table with an old phonograph spinning without making any music. Next to it, a single vinyl record and a note with his uncle's lyrics. "When you're ready to know the truth, listen to this." With shaking hands, Carlos placed the record in the phonograph and lowered the needle. At first there was only static, but then his uncle's broken voice emerged. "Carlos, if you're listening to this, the house has chosen you as it chose me. It's not a curse, it's a transition. The house is not a structure. It's a living organism that has existed for centuries. The previous owners didn't die. We were absorbed. We became part of it. The doors that appear, the hallways that lengthen, the rooms that change, these are manifestations of its digestion. It's studying you, learning about you before it fully assimilates you." His uncle's voice grew fainter, almost a whisper. "Don't fight it. I did it, and I only succeeded in prolonging the inevitable. Accept it, and the transition will be less painful." The record ended, but the phonograph continued to spin. Carlos remained motionless, feeling the room seemed to contract slightly around him, like a stomach preparing to digest. The next morning, Carlos hurriedly packed, determined to leave the mansion for good. As he packed his belongings into his suitcase, he noticed something disturbing. His personal items seemed slightly different. His clothes had a different hue, his books contained underlines he didn't remember making, his phone showed conversations he didn't remember having. As he headed toward the front door, he realized the layout of the house had changed dramatically overnight. What was once a direct path had become a maze of identical hallways. Every time he thought he was close to the exit, he found himself returning to the same point. After hours of frustrated attempts, exhausted and desperate, Carlos dropped to the floor of the hall. It was then that he noticed something he had overlooked. All the paintings that showed the house over the decades had a common detail. In each window looking out, a human figure could be vaguely made out. And in the most recent painting, the figure looked eerily like his uncle Ernesto. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the truth. These were not paintings of the house. They were paintings made by the house, displaying its catches like a predator displays its trophies. The breathing sound that permeated the environment intensified, resonating through every floorboard, every ceiling beam. The house no longer hid its nature. 3 months later, the notary handed over the keys to the property to a young, distant cousin of Carlos. "We haven't heard from him since he moved in," he explained. "Legally, after his mysterious disappearance, the house becomes yours." "It's strange," the cousin commented as he looked at the imposing facade. "Carlos was never the type to disappear without warning." The notary nodded somberly. "It's curious, they said the same thing about Uncle Ernesto. And about the owner before him." As the new owner crossed the threshold, he couldn't help but notice a new painting in the hall, a recent painting of the house in the evening light. And there, in one of the upper windows, a figure looking out with an expression of resigned acceptance. A figure that was undoubtedly Carlos. The door closed behind him with a sound that was strangely reminiscent of a deep, satisfied inhalation.